I thought I'd step back a little bit from particular issues, which we can deal with in the question period, and discuss with you what I think is sort of the grand sweep of contemporary history, at least as it looks to me. What is it going on now? I think the end of the Cold War, about 16 years ago now, represented a sharp historical discontinuity. It was dramatically different from the period that preceded it, the Cold War. The Cold War was a very intense period of history, a very crucial rivalry overhung by the threat of a nuclear war. But it was a very, in a sense, orderly period. We knew who the enemy was. It had a focus. It had a name. We studied it carefully. We knew what their own forces were. We knew what they were about. And everything was focused on that rivalry. It deeply affected our way of life and the way we did it, and it affected our organization. Now, suddenly, in the historic blink of an eye, that was gone. And it's been replaced by almost the polar opposite. It's a world with hundreds of problems all around, but no overwhelming ones. And that in itself is a dramatic change. And it requires a lot of different approaches to things. And not only was the Cold War over, but in my opinion, World War I, not II, World War I was over. Because World War I set in motion many of the currents which beset us during the whole of the 20th century. Recurrent depressions, fascism, communism, socialism, all these sorts of currents we've spent most of our lives on. Now, they're all gone. And also, we have now seen the end of the last of the great empires of the world. And in their place is a lot of chaos. The Austro-Hungarian Empire, problems in the Balkans. The Ottoman Empire, problems in the Middle East. The Russian Empire, problems in Central Asia. And all of these things are happening at pretty much the same time. Now, the Cold War itself masked a lot of what was happening and the decays of all these other things, and also a number of other developments and trends in technology and so on. It masked them. But what we have now is really a world in fundamental readjustment. One of those periods of history where things really dramatically change. I want to discuss illustratively 3 such changes. There are many others, but I'm focusing on these 3 because of what I think are their transcendent importance in understanding what is happening to us now. And those 3 are the nature of war, the structure of power in the world, and globalization. Now, the nature of war. When you use the word war, most people automatically think of a fight between 2 countries, interstate warfare. That's the ordinary definition of what war is. And that's the way we have thought about war, and that's the way we have organized with war. There are elaborate rules for it. How you do it is in the Constitution. All of those sorts of things. Suddenly, interstate war is probably the least likely conflict that we're going to face in the near future. Instead, war has become war inside states, or war with non-state actors like terrorists. The rules are very different It's much less formal, it's much less structured, and we don't really know how to grapple with it. On top of that is the distribution of power in the world. Probably not since the time of the Roman Empire has any state had the military and economic power of the United States. It is awesome, especially compared to all the others. Now, it's been that way really since 1945, when the European powers exhausted or defeated as a result of World War I and World War II fell aside. But it didn't become apparent during the Cold War because of the nuclear strength and capability of the Soviet Union. But it is, and it is new. And the United States is really not used to it. You know, for most of our history, we have been an important power, but we have not been a leading power in the sense of dealing with the world issues and framing the context of responding to crises. Instead, we sat secure behind our two oceans and let the Europeans or others decide what the conflict was, what the rules were, and so on. Then we would decide whether or not to join. But we did not have the job of framing the world debate. And now, all of those who sort of were out in front of us, British, French, so on and so forth, they're gone. And we're out there all alone. And we're not really used to being in that position. Secondly, neither is the rest of the world used to having a country in that position. And they're adjusting to it. And there are two aspects to it. First, there is the natural resentment of any state about a power so great as ours. It's just a natural kind of resentment that people have, the big guy on the block and so on. So that can be expected. Since we're so big, it's good for us to get a kick in the shins now and then. But on top of that, there is the impact of us understanding how big and strong we are and using that strength at sometimes in ways that accentuate the resentment of others at the way we behave. And those two combinations make our problem in the world significantly worse. It's not that we are arrogant, but we do have a sense of our power, and we have a sense of the rightness of what we are after. And therefore, we tend to think others ought to understand and agree with us. And when they don't, we take it as simple recalcitrance, and they take ours as arrogance and using our power against them. The third one is a term which I think is very overworked, but nonetheless important: globalization. National boundaries are eroding. They're eroding in terms of the state being able to control what happens inside the state, which most states feel is their responsibility, their duty. That no longer is true in many senses of the word. Capital flows in and out of the United States are over $1 trillion a day. Can't possibly manage all of that. Health issues are not respecters of national boundaries at all. Environmental issues go across national boundaries as if they were not there. And even more importantly, things like information technology, like radio, like television, like movies. Those things are flooding the world. They're conveying not only facts, messages, cultural, religious, all kinds of messages around the world. One of the things that it's doing is it is politicizing mankind. For most of the world's history, the average individual maybe knew what was going on in his own and maybe the neighboring village, but not anything else. And he didn't care much. His world was the village. Now his world is the world. And there's a television in every village everywhere around the world. And what the average citizen of the world is seeing is something he never imagined in his daily life. And it arouses envy, greed, resentment, hatred, all those kinds of things as he sees what is happening and being told in a variety of different ways with different messages. Many of them are taken to be an assault on his traditions, on his religion, on the way he has practiced things, and many of them have a U.S. label on them. These things are having a profound impact on what happens in the world. And so there's an instantaneous reaction, whether it's to the Pope's remarks, for example, about Muslims. 50 years ago, nobody even paid any attention to it. Now it's around the world in minutes, if not seconds. And that's hard for countries to grapple with. We are no longer in control the way we used to be. And if we're having trouble, young, weak states are in very serious trouble in terms of governance. It is very, very difficult because they're beset with all these images that their people say, why can't we have that? Why can't we do this? Why don't we have those freedoms? And so on. And so it is more and more difficult to govern most of the globe. One of the results is this internal conflict I started to talk about. Terrorism. Political atomization, in the sense that people have greater resentment of people who are a little different, and nationalism has become a more particular thing. Take Yugoslavia, for example. Yugoslavia was set up after World War I. It was a multi-ethnic state, and now it is 6, probably 7 different states. Yugoslavia was small enough, and now there are 6 of them with that much more difficulty in making their way in this world where the problems are so difficult. Terrorism, the same way. Terrorism is fed on the resentment of people who feel themselves assaulted unjustly or who feel that they're being deprived of things that are their right by nature. I think the pervasiveness of globalization as an impact on our lives is akin to, I would say, industrialization 2 centuries ago. When industrialization came, it transformed the world. It brought about the modern nation state, because with industrialization came complexities and the need to regulate labor, the need to regulate business, the need to do all kinds of things like that. And the result was the modern nation state. There was nothing like the modern nation state 250 years ago. They were small entities. They raised money mostly to fight local wars and so on and so forth. So industrialization changed world society. And I think globalization is doing the same thing, but in the opposite direction. Just as industrialization helped create the modern powerful nation state, globalization is weakening that state and making it harder for the state to do things that it used to do automatically. Now, the result of all these things is the world we have today. A very chaotic world, difficult to predict, difficult to manage. And on top of that, we're trying to cope with this world with the habits of mind and the institutions that we learned in the Cold War. We still tend to think, at least old folks like me, in terms of the world of the Cold War, because that's where we grew up. That's the world we lived in for 40 years. And as you see, that world is now gone. And the institutions that we have. Defense Department, just for an example. I mentioned nature of warfare is changing from interstate warfare to internal warfare. And that's happening just as our military establishment has reached the peak of efficiency in terms of fighting a conventional war. We are more able to fight a World War II than we ever have been in our history. Now, I say that facetiously, but that's the kind of military machine that we have perfected. And it is an awesome machine. But it's not the kind of machine to fight an internal struggle in Afghanistan or guerrilla warfare here or there. And so we're trying to adapt. We're trying to take what we have for a different kind of war and make it work. That same thing is true in a less dramatic way in the State Department and the nature of the world and so on. But besides defense, let me take the intelligence community. Now, we've had a turmoil in the intelligence community since 2001. But look at the problem of the intelligence community. For 40 years, it was focused on the Soviet Union, a single target. And we studied it intensively. And a good part of those studies were technical ones, because what was the big threat? The big threat was the Soviets developing something in military technology which would render our missile force, for example, vulnerable or something like that. So overhead photography, read photos, get that. Those are the intelligence. Now, what's the need? To find out what on earth is going on inside Iran. Are the mullahs in charge? Is President Ahmadinejad in charge? What is going on inside Iran? Who would have said 10 years ago that the putative cause of 9/11 would arise from Afghanistan, one of the poorest, most backward countries of the world? Who cared about Afghanistan or what went on there? That's the nature of the problem. It's gone from this kind of a focus to this. Now, that's a dramatic change for an organization trying to collect bits of evidence and put them into an analysis for decision makers. And we're trying still to figure out just how to do that. And the focus has gone from technical intelligence, which you have a lot better sense that you got right, to human intelligence. We want to know the basic facts about what's going on. There are 192 members of the UN now. What's going on inside these countries? What might come up and jump at us as a threat and emerge without us knowing about it? How do you keep the president from being surprised? That's an entirely different job for the intelligence community. NATO. NATO is the most effective military alliance the world's ever seen. It's actually a bunch of countries who know how to fight together. But the purpose for which they're fighting has disappeared. It was an attack across the Fulda Gap in Germany. It's gone. Now, can we figure out how to use this wonderful military alliance for purposes which are relevant in the world today? And we're struggling with that. We're using them in Afghanistan. But, you know, it's working with indifferent success because there's not the unity in dealing with Afghanistan, especially with soldiers being killed, as there was with there's a threat if the Soviets attack Europe. It's a very different kind of a problem. And last but not least, there is the United Nations, which was built or constructed in a very different world, the world of 1945. In that world, there were 51 members of the original United Nations. And they were all similar states in the sense that most of them had history going back centuries, if not thousands of years. They were all organized in, you know, there were democracies, autocracies, all kingdoms, all kinds of things. But they were similar looking kind of entities. There are now 192 states. Now, most of that other, above the 51, were colonies of one kind or another, or didn't even have the dignity of colonies, were just nothings. Now they're a majority of the UN, and they have attitudes fundamentally different from those of the 51 originals, a lot of it being resentment about being colonialized and exploited. Now, how do you get them to organize and work together for common goals that we think are logical, but they think are a vestige of colonialism? The Security Council was set up deliberately in 1945 so that the countries who represented power in the world and who would have to carry out UN decisions would be in the Security Council. They represented power in the world in 1945, except for China that got in for special reasons. But now, the world has changed. Now, they still represent power more closely than one might have imagined after all this time. But they're not representative of the top power in the world in every sense. Can we change it? I don't know. And lastly, the UN was founded on the sovereign independence of its members. And Article 3 of the UN says, nothing in the UN Charter shall give the UN the right to interfere in matters essentially within the domestic jurisdiction of its members. That is, stay out of internal affairs of the member states. But since that time, we've had a genocide convention, we've had other kinds of conventions, and there's a general sense that the UN has what's called the responsibility to protect. That is, in the event that a country cannot or does not protect major elements of its population, it is the right and duty of the UN to intervene. Now, that's generally accepted. But it runs directly counter to the Charter, which says you do not intervene. And that's what Darfur is all about right now. We deeply feel that there are some horrors going on there, and the international community wants to intervene. And Sudan says, no. And we're paralyzed. So this is an example of the fact that we're hamstrung by the overhang of old practices, and we're hamstrung by the institutions we have in dealing with this brand new set of issues. Now, how have we reacted as a country to this? To the end of the Cold War. The first reaction was one of great relief relaxation, maybe even drift. Not indifference, but there was no more threat to our existence. We didn't have this horrible thought that maybe in 30 minutes there might be Soviet bombers and missiles dropping nuclear weapons on the United States. We were involved in international affairs, but it didn't matter much because there was no great threat. And as the U.S. frequently does in such periods, again, secure, although we're not secure anymore, behind our two oceans, we sort of didn't pay any attention to what was going on in the world. And acted tactically, but without saying this is a different, and analyzing this as a different world, and how do we deal with it strategically. It's not easy to do because it was such a different world. But that's what we were for about a decade. And then came 9/11. 9/11 was a profound shock. Both because, wars like that don't happen in the United States. It's been over 100 years since we had war fighting in the United States. We had Pearl Harbor, but that was 2,000 miles out in the Pacific, and we did not internalize it. And so this was a profound shock to us. It also awakened us to the fact that there were a lot of things going on in the world that we hadn't paid much attention to. One of them is, the fight over when did we discover terrorism and so on and so forth, and Clinton's latest dramatic defense of what he'd done. But that's just an example. Did we pay attention to it? None of these mattered so much because we're still in this sense of relief from the fact we didn't have to worry about a nuclear holocaust. But suddenly we realized this was a tough world, and the trends were going against us. And we were in pretty bad shape. And I think the result was a reaction to the shock in the sense of a stimulation of what I would call a philosophical division in U.S. foreign policy as to how we ought to behave. And it was a struggle between two approaches, which I call the traditionalist and the transformationalist. And the traditionalist said, we ought to do things, we ought to approach our foreign policy the way we always have. Reach out to our friends and our allies and international organizations and develop a grand coalition of like-minded states to deal with the problems. The transformationalists said, no, we don't have time for that. 9/11 showed us that things are going bad really fast. Furthermore, we now have unprecedented strength. We ought to use it, and we'll use it for good, and after we have solved the problems, the world will recognize that we have done it right. And those two were at odds for some time over the past 4 years. The transformational approach, which won out, has led us more or less directly into Iraq. Now, let me back up for just a moment. These approaches to foreign policy, this is really sort of the third, I would call, iteration in the way we have approached foreign policy. The first I would call Washington and Adams. In the time of President Washington, we had the philosophy, no entangling alliances. We had our own country here. We were secure. We didn't have to meddle in Europe. We didn't want Europe meddling with us. Instead, we were the shining city on the hill. We were an example of man's ability to live in peace and harmony with his neighbor. We hoped people would emulate that, but whether they did or not was up to them. So when the French Revolution came, for example, and Citizen Genet, who was the representative of the revolutionaries, said to the United States, we helped you in your Revolutionary War, now you come help us. And we said, good luck. This was best articulated by John Quincy Adams, who said, wherever the flag of liberty and freedom is unfurled, there will be our hearts, our minds, and our hopes. But we go not in search of monsters to destroy. We are the well-wishers of all who seek freedom and liberty. We are the vindicators and defenders only of our own. And so when the Hungarian Revolution came in 1848, they said, we believe in your Constitution. We believe in your Declaration of Independence. And we said, good luck. And that was sort of our approach, the shining city on the hill, until Woodrow Wilson. And he says that's inadequate. That's passive. We need to be active. We need to go out and promote democracy. And since that time, we have had a debate within the United States on whether or not our foreign policy ought to be motivated solely by the national interest, or whether it ought to be maybe the national interest plus trying to instill democracy in the world. And then comes the transformationalist and said, no, we need to push democracy by force if necessary. In other words, we're going to force people to be free. And that didn't come out exactly right. But that is the general notion, that we need to push it. We need to be actively hit it. And that, as I say, that in part led us into to Iraq, both to begin this process of democratization in Iraq as an example to the rest of the Middle East, and incidentally also to demonstrate the awesomeness of U.S. military power and the fact that you cross us only at your great peril. Now, Iraq has, predictably for some, turned out nothing like the transformationalists envisioned. In addition, it perhaps has made resolution of other problems of the region, Iran, Afghanistan, Palestine, terror, more difficult, as well as diverting adequate attention to many other problems around the world pressing on this new world environment. Now that's more or less where we are right now. To sum up, we're still in the process of adjusting to this very different world. And the pains of that adjustment are all too apparent to us right now as we look around the world. And it's not all our fault. Now, the future course of events in the world are going to certainly influence where we come out in this debate. But ultimately, the American people will decide on our future course. As we do, I trust we will be mindful of the traditions and the values which have made us the most respected state in history. As a final note, while this, I hope I've demonstrated this is an unfamiliar world full of problems, I think it's also a world without the mortal perils of the Cold War, and it thus holds out the possibility of a better century than mankind has yet seen, if we can act with wisdom and understanding. We, the United States, I think, are beginning to realize this is not a world susceptible to U.S. domination. And the rest of the world, I hope, is learning that without U.S. leadership, nothing really serious can be accomplished. Thank you very much.
Let's start with a current one. Because of the change in warfare, do you think we can or should change our intelligence gathering?
We have to put much more emphasis on human intelligence, because what we most want to know around the world is what are people thinking, what are they contemplating, what are the differences going on inside other states. That is a much harder job than the technical intelligence we concentrated on. And while we were concentrating on technical intelligence, we neglected human intelligence, and it has atrophied. And that's a very difficult job, and it's in a sense anti-American, because you can't rely on efficiency and effectiveness. You've got to put somebody somewhere, and maybe you leave them for a decade and nothing happens. But in the meantime, he's getting inside the culture, inside the system, inside the access to information. But our tendency is to pull them up by the roots every 6 months and say, what have you done? So it's going to be very hard for us. George Tenet a year or so ago says it's going to take us 5 years to reconstitute. I think he's optimistic. It's very tough to do. We can do it, but it's going to take a long, hard time. And that's what we really need to do to improve the president's ability to make wise decisions. And that's what intelligence is all about. It's not predicting the fall of the Soviet Union or as much as it is reducing. When the president has to make a decision about things, he's dealing with a half a deck. He doesn't know all the facts. And what intelligence is designed is to reduce that area of uncertainty, to give him more confidence in going this way rather than that way. And it's a hard job, and we're still struggling out. Organization is not going to solve the problems. They're cultural. But a bad organization can interfere with dealing with the problem.
Could you mention Africa after colonialization? Any hope for that continent?
Africa is just emerging on this world stage. They're just now being beset by all of the modern communications and so on and so forth. And what they're discovering is that Africa is a continent which was turned into states by the Europeans drawing lines on a map. And they don't make any sense almost anywhere. And they cut across tribes, they cut across cultures, they cut across geographical areas. As Africa awakens, I think we perhaps, I hope not, but perhaps could see problems like they're happening in the Middle East. It's very difficult, but it is lively now, and you can already see some of the incipient problems that we're facing in other areas. So I think Africa, we have a lot of room for maneuver in Africa, but I think unless we act, it's likely to get worse before it gets better.
Here's a good segue to that. Don't all the aspects of globalization suggest that the notion of nation states, boundaries, state actors, and empires are now outdated concepts?
Yeah, they probably are in a broad sweep of history, but we're where we are now, and you can't get from here to there in one day. For example, the UN is a very imperfect instrument. As I say, it was built for a world which is past. But if we were to start from scratch today, we couldn't build a UN. There's no way that we could get enough world agreement to put together a UN which is as effective as this one. So what we have to try to do is to make it more effective. And the United States is very ambivalent about the UN. We love to hate the UN. And where I come from out in Utah, a helicopter goes across at night and somebody says, "There's the UN spying on us." So we have this visceral dislike for the organization. And yet, as soon as we get in trouble, as soon as we have a problem with somebody, we threaten to take them to the Security Council. So we can't have it both ways. And I think, in the end, most people in the world want to do the right thing. So if we're really reaching out, we'll have most people with us. So if we behave as we can behave, we're likely to have the at least psychological weight of the UN on our side. And while that maybe won't win wars, in the long run, it'll make a big difference. If you look at the difference, for example, between the first Gulf War and the second Gulf War. In the first Gulf War, we had the UN. As a matter of fact, we got approval from the UN Security Council before we got approval from the Congress. And we had virtually complete support. We had the world behind us because we had made the case, we had gone to them, we had convinced them. That was not possible this time. So we went into Iraq with most of the world feeling we were acting against them rather than with them. The UN is infinitely frustrating. As I say, the majority of the General Assembly, which is the one that sets the budget and all so on and so forth, are colonies, and they resent us anyway. So it's hard work. It's the hard work of diplomacy. You sit down with them one-on-one. Ask them what kind of world they want. Ask them what their problems are. Work with them so that they have the sense that you're on their side. That's hard work.
It's hard work fielding these good questions, too, and thinking out how to follow on. Do you regard global warming as a national security issue? If so, what role should the U.S. take in seeking solutions to the problem?
Well, I do now, yes. And what has really convinced me is evidence of the decline of the ice caps in the Arctic and the Antarctic. And I'm afraid it's a geometric advance, because what happens in the ice caps is the white snow and ice reflects 90% of the sun's rays. As soon as the ice melts and you have the dark ocean, it absorbs 90% of the sun's rays. So each little diminution of the ice has a double effect on global warming. I think there is a role for nations. We could do a lot more on energy efficiency in this country than we do. That's one thing. I think we need to try to develop an international energy strategy so that we can balance supply and demand. I think we need to accelerate our interest in nuclear energy. It has threats associated with it, but not nearly the threats that fossil fuel energy does. And they're threats that international cooperation can deal with. So yes, I think energy is a very important problem, and it's one where I think we can make discernible progress. We can't turn it around overnight, but I think in the long run, yeah.
Okay, we're going to do one more international and current affairs question, and then there are some interesting ones about his experiences with President Ford and President Bush. Here's the international. How large of a player do you think that China will be in international affairs in the next 25 to 50 years?
China will be an enormous influence because China has an economy which will probably be in 25, 30 years, certainly the second economy, maybe even larger in gross terms than the U.S. economy in that time. That gives them an enormous power. But China is, well, it's a complicated situation. China, for the last 25 years, has focused on economic development and on the theory that the way they can assure peace and stability is to give the average Chinese a sense that his life is getting better every year, so that per capita GNP goes up, he feels better, therefore he's less, not so discontented. And that has been their model, and it has worked dramatically. But in the process, I think that their political structure has not evolved with their economic structure, and it's kind of badly out of whack now. And I think the leaders realize it's out of whack, but they really don't know what to do about it. They are frightened, I think, of democracy or anything resembling it, because to them, democracy means instability, and they're petrified about the notion of instability with 300 million people. So they're struggling. They have huge problems. They have problems of corruption, they have problems of rich and poor, they have problems of country, city, they have enormous problems. And as I say, I think they have what I would call a primitive political system to deal with the problems of a modern economy. They realize you can't have a modern economy without communications. And yet communications is one of the big threats to them, so they try to control it. That's just one of the examples. I think they will probably work themselves through. I guess what I would say in the end is that China is not Hitler's Germany. It's not Stalin's Russia. It is a very different country from ours. They have different history, different traditions. We're going to rub against each other in many ways, but I don't think that hostility is foreordained. We can make them an enemy if we treat them as an enemy, but I think there is no reason that there's not room for a vastly stronger China in a world that we would find comfortable to our values.
I'm going to add one more international that just came in. What do you think about the role of the European Union today as a civilian power? What was your experience in dealing with the European communities during the Ford administration?
Well, we didn't have a European community during the Ford administration, so it was easy. But well, at the end, one of the problems, we've had that was facetious, but since the coal and steel community in '48, there has been a growing sense of Europe, but it has become increasingly awkward for us to deal with, because in one of Henry Kissinger's more famous comments, you don't know what the telephone number is. You can't pick up the phone and call the EU, in a sense. And so for a time at the end of the Ford administration, and especially later on, the Europeans would say, well, we can't discuss with you because we have not concerted among ourselves to know what the policy is. So it said, okay, we'll wait. Then after they had concerted and reached a policy, we'd go to them and they'd say, well, we can't discuss it with you. We can't make changes because we've already agreed among ourselves. So it's a difficult problem. But I think the whole issue of the EU is a fascinating issue, because what has really happened is that the political leaders of Europe have moved on toward consolidating toward a United States of Europe. when all of a sudden they had a referendum and the people of Europe said, we don't like it. And it has thrown them back. And now they're struggling. And I can't remember whether it was the German, I think the French foreign minister maybe said, well, no, it wasn't the foreign minister, it was, well, anyway, one of the French candidates for presidency said, well, we need to get going again, we need to formulate how the UN, but we're not going to have any more referendums. So that's the kind of state. And I think what's going to happen, as the EU broadens, and I think that's been good, as you look at what has happened in Eastern Europe and what has happened over the last 4 or 5 years in Turkey as they try to get ready, it has been a big driver for improvement in the internal structure and operation of government. So it has been a definite, beneficent influence. But as the union gets broader, it's going to be hard to make it deeper. And for a time, when there were only 10 or 11, what they had in mind, they're going to get deeper into a United States of Europe and broader. Now I think they're beginning to realize they can't do both. And my guess is they'll stop considerably short over the foreseeable future, short of a United States of Europe, but something more than simply a customs union.
Okay, we'll wrap in just a couple of minutes and let you enjoy refreshments and meet General Scowcroft, but let's have a couple about the Ford White House. Two related to the fall of Saigon. What was the climate in the Ford White House during the fall of Saigon and the Mayaguez incident? And another question, do you believe that the fall of Saigon brought about a decline of U.S. hegemony?
Well, I don't think the U.S. had hegemony, with or without the fall of Saigon. But the climate, the fall of Saigon, was one of desperation, in a way. I think one of President Ford's most courageous moments was about a month to 6 weeks before the fall of Saigon, when it became quite clear President Thieu was withdrawing his troops to defend the Central Island. It was fairly clear that the end was close. And the Senate Foreign Relations Committee came down to the White House and met with the president in the cabinet room. And to a man, they said, it's time to pull the troops out so they don't get trapped by the North Vietnamese. And President Ford said, no. Said, we've got thousands and thousands of Vietnamese who have staked their lives on their ally, the United States, have fought with us. I'm not going to abandon them. And he kept the troops there, and he kept an airlift going right down to the last minute on his own. And if something had gone wrong, he had no one to blame but himself. He took that on himself. And I thought that was just infinitely courageous. And as a result, there are thousands of Vietnamese who escaped death or prison camp because of what he did. The actual end of Saigon was very difficult. As a matter of fact, when the last helicopter left and we sort of cheered, the helicopter got about halfway out to the carrier where it was going to land. And we found out, lo and behold, we left the Marine Guard in the embassy. So we had to send another helicopter out to pick them up and have them leave. But that left us with the notion that the world would think we were withdrawing from Asia, and that was a dangerous signal. So along come the Mayaguez, which was a complete surprise. For those of you who don't remember, the Mayaguez was a commercial steamer that was captured off the coast of Cambodia. And it was a complete surprise to us. But we decided that, first of all, we didn't want the Cambodians to be able to capture an American crew and imprison them and use them as hostages against the United States. So that was the first one. The second one was, this was an opportunity to demonstrate that, indeed, while we had gotten out of Saigon, we were a power to be reckoned with in the Pacific, and we had not turned isolationists, and we had not gone home. So it would probably, I can't imagine a more difficult military operation. We had no troops off Cambodia. We had some troops in Thailand. We had some aircraft elsewhere. But we brought carriers from the Philippines, diverted carriers going to Australia from the Philippines, brought them in. We flew aircraft from Thailand, and we brought Marines from Okinawa, and we assembled them all to deal with the Mayaguez incident. And I remember when they launched the planes from the carriers to attack military places in Cambodia, they were so far away that they couldn't have gotten back to the carrier. But by the time they had launched their mission and so on, the carrier would have been close enough to get back. It was that tight. So those were pretty hair-raising times.
Great. Let's turn to the question of the photo on the cover of tonight's program. General Scowcroft, the question is, what's the story of the picture with you and President Ford?
That picture was taken at Helsinki in 1975. And Helsinki was a new accord between Europe, the United States, and the Soviet Union. And it was very, very controversial. Because what it did, while it affirmed the freedom of individuals and the right of free speech and so on and so forth, it also ratified the borders of Europe. And so it was extremely controversial. And President Ford faced a hurricane of opposition. And this was whispering to them in the plenary sessions where everyone was giving speeches and so on and so forth. It turned out to be a very historic conference. And the Helsinki Accord was used by dissidents inside Eastern Europe to claim their rights of free speech and so on. And it really started the ferment that in 1989 turned into the revolutions which freed Europe.
Would you prefer a domestic or an international question?
False.
What characteristics would you look for in the president and other national leaders as we try to sort out a new approach to the world?
Let me say just this. The next president, whoever he or she is going to have one hell of a time. Okay?